I'm Ben Beyond Repair, and I hit Challenger for the first time in Season 15. I was actually hard stuck in High Plat and Low Diamond for years, but made massive improvements a few years ago, and this comprehensive guide will help people understand Braum and the game better. Before we even think about items, runes, and summoner spells, let's talk about climbing and getting better at the game. While League is an extremely complicated game, and there's always more to learn, I believe that the most important factors for getting good at the game can be boiled down to a few points. Abilities. When you're first starting out, learn what all of the abilities and passives in the game are. This includes item actives and passives that are often as strong as abilities. Most players learn abilities from seeing them in game, but for many abilities and passives, you won't get a visual indication of how every part of the ability works. Even many high-ranked players don't know exactly what all of the abilities in the game do. Spending 5 minutes reading or trying out the ability and practice tool, reading the League wiki, or watching champion spotlights is a much better way to learn. I know it can be daunting to learn so many abilities and champions, so I recommend starting with champions in your role and sorting by pick rate so you make the best use of your time. Special ability interactions. Learn how abilities interact with each other. This is especially important for Braum. Sometimes abilities will not interact with each other in a special way. For example, a Caitlyn Q versus a Sivir Q. They would react basically as you would expect. However, sometimes abilities have special ability interactions. For example, Braum making Ornn ult disappear with his E. Many players stop learning once they know the abilities in the game, and they don't think much about what happens when two champions use their abilities at each other, creating these special ability interactions. If you thought learning every ability was hard, if there are 700 abilities in the game and each one of those abilities has an interaction with every other ability, then there are 490,000 ability interactions, far too many for one person to learn in their entire lifetime. Luckily, most of these aren't special, but I assure you the number of special ability interactions is still in the tens of thousands. This is one of the reasons why focusing on a small pool of champions is so much easier. By only focusing on a champion like Braum, we only have to worry about 4 or 5 abilities times 700 other abilities instead of 700 times 700. Understanding your limits. You'll need to develop a strong feeling for when you can and can't win a fight versus every champion in the game. Whether it's 1v1 at different HP levels, mana levels, with different random champions on either side of the fight, depending on the items and levels. Did I mention League was a complicated game? This, like so many skills, can only be developed through playing many games and fighting in different scenarios. When I play new champions, I tend to kill myself a lot, 10 to 20 times per game, to learn how much damage I deal and how much damage I take, as well as what fights I win and what fights I lose. Could I try a new champion, play safe, and only die a few times? Sure, but I'll learn to play that champion much slower than if I limit test, so don't be afraid to feed. Map awareness. Ultimately, in League, you can only die to enemy champions. This means that if you have a good understanding of your limits and what fights you can and cannot win, you'll only die if you lose track of where your teammates are or where the enemy team is. Since we're given our teammates' positions at all times on the map, there's really no excuse for fighting without them, only to realize later they weren't there. League is all about keeping track of the enemy team at all times so that you never enter a fight where the numbers are different than you expect. Some people recommend looking at your minimap every 3 seconds or so, but I think this can be wrong. Even 3 seconds of not looking at the map can result in you missing key information about the enemy jungler. For example, if they cross a ward for 1 or 2 seconds, or pop a vision plant, which you can see being popped in fog. At a high level, it's simply bad to not constantly be looking at your minimap for changes. When you're good at the game, you are so comfortable with your champion that you can spend all of your time looking at the minimap unless you're completely preoccupied with fighting. But when you're learning your champion, similar to limit testing, you need to focus on your laning and mechanics, so don't worry so much about the map if you aren't capable of watching it all the time. Instead, focus on improving your mechanics and then transition to watching your minimap all the time once you've mastered the champion. Before the game starts, before we even queue up, there's so much more to think about. Are we mentally and physically at our best? What is our game plan and strategy? Trying to win means playing in your best condition possible and taking care of yourself. Make sure that you've taken a shower, brushed your teeth, shaved, taking care of your responsibilities, that you're not tired, hungry, thirsty, too hot, or too cold before playing a game. It's amazing how much better our decision making is when we're present and focused, and how easy it is to tilt when we're tired or hungry. These things aren't difficult and make good life habits anyways, so try to incorporate them into your pregame routine. For climbing strategy, focus on playing as few champions as possible. By understanding a champion well, you can focus on other aspects of the game like map awareness and become a better player. When you create a lobby and select your roles, it will show you what roles are priority and what ones aren't. If a role is priority, it means that not as many people are queuing up for that role at the moment. Riot offers autofill protection to people who are queuing for priority roles to get more people to queue up for that role. The roles which are priority change fairly often, and if you restart your lobby every few minutes, you can wait to queue up until your role is in priority. This should only take a few tries, but sometimes doesn't work. Since the client only checks what roles are priority when you create a new lobby, you can continue to enjoy autofill protection for as many games in a row as you want until you have to dodge or restart your client or join another lobby. Just repeat the process if you need to make a new lobby. Riot has introduced better autofill and second role parity, and as a result, it's much easier to win if you're on a second role or filled compared to before. If you're capable of playing a second role at the same level as your main, it can be beneficial to both queue and play for those secondary role games, since you're going to have a better chance of winning than someone else who got their secondary role but doesn't play it at all. When selecting a second role, many people choose the most popular role, often mid, so that they're less likely to get their secondary role even if they're better at a different role besides mid. Given the changes, it really depends on how good you are at your second best role and how often you would get your second role. For example, if you put support second, you would get it so frequently that you may want to put mid secondary instead, even if you're better at support. If you're better at one role and want to use your time efficiently to practice that role anyways, I just recommend dodging when you get filled or your secondary role. If you're in queue for a game and the time you've been in queue goes above the expected wait time, you should cancel your queue and re-queue up. This is because the longer you've been waiting over the estimated wait time, the more desperate the game is to match you with the team right away. This will result in you or your teammates getting autofilled or secondary roles more often, and it will take longer to find a game if you re-queue, but it's worth it if you want to play higher quality games. After rebalancing the sides, the blue side now has around a 52% win rate at all ranks. It has been a known climbing strategy to dodge every game on the side more likely to lose as a way to inflate your MMR ever since Dopa/Apto did it in Korean solo queue years ago. But this is obviously a very slow climbing process because you're dodging pretty much every other game. Champion Select. The game starts in Champion Select. It's a time for you to actively think about what order your team should be picking in, and you should start paying attention in case people want to trade. As champion gets picked, you can start thinking about what ability interactions are best for you and what runes, items, and summoner spells to go. Oftentimes, I also facilitate all of the trades that my team needs to make, single-handedly ordering us in Champion Select. Some people use external software to see who their teammates are and multi-search them like in seasons past so they can dodge if their team picks champions that they're bad at. This is not something I do or recommend, as Riot has said that it gives an unfair competitive advantage and is bannable, but as far as I know, they have no way to detect something like this. Win condition. There's a concept in the card game Magic the Gathering called Who's the Beatdown. This concept can be applied to many things, including League, but the basic idea is to ask who wins by default over time and who has to act to make something happen before they automatically lose. A basic version of applying this to League is to think about a scaling comp versus an early game comp. The scaling comp will eventually win by default if the game is even or if they only fall slightly behind. The early game team has to create large leads in order to win the game, but their champions are also designed to help them do that. The team that has to play the beatdown can change throughout the game. For example, a scaling team which is about to lose Dragon Soul, which will almost certainly cost them the game, is now forced to take action themselves. So now the pressure to act is on the late game team because the early game team did a proper job of putting them in a potentially game-losing scenario, and I have a whole other video called Who's the Beatdown on my channel about this concept. Summoner spells. In Champion Select, I look to see whether my team is the late game team or the early game team, and adapt both my playstyle in game and my summoner spell choices accordingly. If my team is the late game scaling team, then I lean towards taking Exhaust because it's a better defensive option to give us survivability so we can get to our late game win condition. On the other hand, if we have to win early, then I'll take Ignite. I also changed the way that I play the game. If we scale, I'll take fewer risks and only fight when we have a guaranteed advantage. If we're the early game team, I look to all in my lane opponent, sometimes even without knowing where the enemy jungler is, because we have to take risks to get ahead. Of course, Ignite is also better into heavy healing teams, and Exhaust is better into teams with a lot of assassins or burst damage, and Heal is also becoming a great viable option for many supports, even including Braum, and leans more towards the conservative scaling playstyle. Using Braum's abilities. Braum should max Q, then E, then W. There's a little bit of debate between maxing E first versus Q, but it's pretty clear that Q will provide much more damage than maxing E would reduce, and the data also suggests that Braum's Q is better. Braum's passive. While XP isn't as important on support compared to other roles, all supports want to hit level 6 as soon as possible to gain access to their ult. At level 6 and level 11, Braum's passive cooldown on the same target is also reduced by 2 seconds each, so don't ignore XP, especially when close to level 11 on Braum. Braum's passive lasts for 4 seconds, but this 4-second window is refreshed every time you or an ally apply another passive stack. This means that you could in theory keep Braum passive up for as long as 16 seconds on the same champion. Most of your teammates won't realize this and give up on trying to activate Braum passive if it's been a while since it was first applied. You can hit someone with 2 Qs per passive if you have 50 ability haste and Q maxed, or less if you or an ally extend the duration of your passive with an auto in the middle of its duration. Even 25 ability haste lets you Q twice on the same passive if you or an ally hit them 2 seconds or later after you first applied your passive. Since your passive is a stun, make sure to use proper CC chaining. CC chaining is when you make sure not to use multiple CCs at the same time, wasting their effectiveness. Unless you have to use Q to get the 3rd or the 4th proc of your passive, it's better to use it earlier or hold it for after the stun so that you don't waste the duration of your Q slow during your passive stun. Your passive is so strong, it's like having 2 abilities level 1 compared to most champions' 1 ability. This is because it does a ton of damage and hard CCs. This makes you one of the strongest level 1 champions in the game. Make sure to abuse this through cheesing and even looking for all-ins level 1. Braum's Q. Your Q does damage, applies your passive from range, and slows. But the most important aspects are being able to apply your passive from range in the slow. Rarely ever use your Q just to do a little bit of damage. It opens you up to all-ins and ganks, and in teamfights, being able to apply passive to 2 people by throwing your Q at someone you aren't currently auto-attacking is often better 95% of the time compared to using Q on the same person you're autoing. If you have to use Q to peel the same person you're autoing because they're threatening to kill you or whoever you're peeling, then use Q for damage and an extra passive stack, but it's better not to be in this spot in the first place. In League, slows don't stack, so if someone's hit by 2 slows at the same time, the higher slow will be applied and the lesser slow does nothing. Try to CC chain properly by not slowing someone when they're already being slowed, waiting to use your Q until right before the end of someone else's stun duration or your own passive stun duration, and not using Q right before someone's about to be stunned. Braum's W. Braum's W gives armor and MR to yourself and an ally and allows you to dash. The dash is much more important, so 95% of the time you should be trying to use it as a dash instead of just giving it for the armor and MR. Especially during laning, I use Braum W to jump to minions 95% of the time instead of to an ally, despite it not giving any armor or magic resist to them. This is because if your lane opponent walks within range of your W plus your auto attack range, you can initiate a fight that's often very favorable. This allows Braum to play very aggressively as opposed to only waiting to counter engage. Normally when you cast W and try to throw Q or R, it will wait until you land and then initiate the Q or R animation, making for a very slow, predictable timing. However, if you use E at the same time as W, it allows you to throw your Q at R Q or R at any point in midair during your W. This allows you to vary the timing as well as go for a much quicker combo to catch your opponents off guard. The downside is that you're using your E just to throw your Q or your ult quicker instead of saving E for an impactful ability or damage to counter. This is okay to use sometimes when looking to all in during laning or if you desperately need to pick someone before a team fight, but be careful when you choose to use this. Braum's E. Your E gives you 10% movement speed, blocks projectiles, blocks 100% of the first instance of damage that hits you unless it's true damage, and reduces the damage taken after that from 35% to 55% depending on how many points you have in it. The best use of your E is to block important abilities like Ornold or to block several impactful auto attacks from the enemy ADC. Because of this, 95% of the time, you should be holding Braum E, patiently waiting for those abilities or situations when the enemy ADC is free firing, instead of just using it to make yourself tankier or give yourself movement speed. You can use your W to help you reposition your E during teamfights to get better E's off. Braum's ult. Braum's ult knocks up enemies and leaves a slow field on the ground afterwards. It's a little bit counterintuitive, because the first enemy hit is knocked up for longer the further away from Braum they are. Starting at 0.6 seconds to 1 second if you have 1 point in your ult, and 0.6 seconds to 1.5 seconds maximum knockup if you have 2 points in your ult. You're very rarely going to get to 3 points in your ult, but at level 16 with 3 points in your ult, it can knock up as much as 2 seconds. All other enemies are knocked up for 0.6 seconds. This encourages you to hit long-range ults on a single target, despite the ult being very slow and hard to hit. The best way to achieve this is by ulting when your teammates set you up by CCing someone, or by landing your Q first to make it harder for them to dodge a long-range ult. It's also fine to ult a group of your enemies if they're somewhat close, as long as you're hitting at least 2 people. Your ult has a low knockup duration, so often using it to cancel key abilities like MF ult or Malzahar ult is a better use than trying to hit multiple people or knock one person up for a long time. Only use your ult on someone right next to you to peel if you absolutely need to in order for you or an ally to survive, because the knockup duration is so much lower. Be sure to use the slow field effectively by aiming your ult in a good direction for the slow field. Sometimes this even means backwards, since your ult knocks people up in a circle around you, so that your team can kite backwards across the slow field. In-game plan. While League is a complicated, ever-changing game, the beginning of the game is somewhat static. It's good to go into the game with a solid understanding of what's happening and what you want to do with your lane. That's why I always have a plan for the start of the game. Once in game, you can either invade or defend. Braum is extremely strong level 1, and people like to invade on the champion, but I personally don't recommend invading. Invading is hard to coordinate in solo queue, and it will add significant volatility to the outcomes of your games. If you're the better player, you should opt for a less risky method of getting ahead, since invading level 1 can often determine the outcome of the game level 1, and sometimes in a very negative favor despite you being a strong champion level 1. You shouldn't have to leash, but in lower ranks your jungler may want you to. If you have to leash, make sure to do so without losing Guardian to your jungler. Guardian's on a 90-second cooldown, so if you lose it while leashing, you won't have it for an all-in level 2. Guardian will proc if someone is hit twice in a row by the buff. In order to avoid losing Guardian, tank the first shot for your jungler. You can then let the buff hit your jungler once, and leave Guardian range of your jungler before it hits them again by either stopping leashing at that point, since your passive is going to do a lot for them, or by kiting in and out of the Guardian range when the buff goes in to hit your jungler. If you don't have to leash, you can cheese in a bush, and it's best to cheese in the forwardmost lane bush instead of in tri-brush, because they're forced to walk past it to come into lane, whereas they don't have to walk through tri-brush. Try to contest level 2, but in most matchups, if you have to leash or your cheese doesn't go well, you will be pushed in on Braum. Try to hide in bushes and preserve your HP instead of letting them trade, so that you can fight later when you're the same level and the wave is bouncing back off of your tower. Take E level 2 if you're losing and your jungler is pathing away from you towards top. Take W level 2 if your jungler is coming bot, or if you get level 2 first. If you get level 2 first, trade with them, if they're in range, by jumping to a minion with W and then autoing them into Q into an auto again. You should ward around 10 to 15 seconds after hitting level 2 in bot lane, which gives you just enough time to trade or fight with them level 2, and then go drop a ward in the pixel brush in the river. This ward timing lets you spot early 3 camp ganks, while also lasting long enough to spot out ganks after an entire full clear. If you have control of the wave, you can shove in wave 3 and take an early recall. This is called a cheater recall. If their jungler is pathing bot, recalling here is very good because it leaves their jungler bot with no option to gank since we're off the map. We also get a free recall to get a small early item advantage like boots. If they full clear, they could gank around 340. If your jungler's coming bot, you probably shouldn't opt to cheater recall because you'll be off map when your jungler's looking to make a play around you. If we have to stay in lane because we're being shoved in, then we continue laning as normal. Make sure to protect yourself from these gank timers. Also try to regain control of the lane and look for our own free recall when you can shove the wave in. Continue laning and looking for advantages while keeping track of the players on the enemy team. When your ADC is dead, at base, or the wave is coming into you bot and your ADC can't get dove because maybe you know where the enemy jungler is, look to roam to help mid, jungle, top, get deep vision, or roam up for grubs. If your tower falls, ward for your AD carry to safely farm, hopefully they'll freeze outside of your tier 2 tower, and perma roam. If their bottom tower falls, move with your ADC to another lane and try to take their tier 1 towers. Pay attention to objective spawn timers so that you can ward around the objective about 1 minute and 30 seconds before it spawns. Then recall to reset all of your wards and run back to the objective. This way, if they clear your vision, you're still arriving at the objective in time with a full new set of wards. Always sweep vision before placing wards so you don't give away the location of where you've placed them, or save sweepers right before the fight so that you clear vision when they don't have time to go back to base and replenish their wards or replace them. Continuously roam and look to either pick the most overextended player on the enemy team or protect your most overextended player from their team collapsing. Ping a lot to communicate with your team and take objectives when the opportunity arises, and give objectives from behind if it's unlikely to be worth it. Teamfight well by using the abilities in the way that was pre-planned during the loading screen and in this guide. For runes, I run Guardian, but Hail of Blades is a viable alternative, especially in lower ranks. It's hard to objectively compare which one is better since there's not a ton of data on Hail of Blades and they accomplish very different things, but I've ran both extensively, even in high elo. If you want to take the standard runes, run Guardian and Font of Life every game. Bone Plating and Second Wind should be changed out every game in Champion Select. If they have a lot of burst or all-in potential, think of engaged supports like Nautilus, then take Bone Plating for all-in durability. If they have a lot of poke, think harder matchups like Karma or Senna, then go Second Wind instead. The 4th rune slot is quite bad at the moment, but Overgrowth is the best because it simply makes you tankier than Unflinching, and Braum doesn't have enough healing and shielding for Revitalize to do better than the other runes. For secondary runes, I run Biscuits and Approach Velocity. Biscuits are very helpful for dealing with poke in lane and becoming tankier, and Approach Velocity synergizes really well with Braum Q, allowing you to chase people down for your passive procs. Other decent secondary runes can include going Cosmic Insight, which is generically good, but doesn't seem to be performing as well as some of the other runes. Braum's also not a very summoner spell dependent champion. Magical Footwear, but I think that boots are too important early on support because of roaming to wait so long to be able to get them, and also certain skill shot based matchups, especially ones like Karma that are tough for Braum, are better if you can buy boots early. Hook champions as well, Thresh, Nautilus. Triumph and Legend Haste used to be built much more frequently, but they're being built less and less on Braum, and their win rate data and my experience running both suggests that they aren't as good. Finally, for stats, I take Ability Haste, Movement Speed, and Flat HP. Some people like attack speed on Braum, but the benefit from the attack speed is just not as much as the 8 Ability Haste, especially in the early game. Movement speed is a very valuable stat, and so taking the extra movement speed gives you a little bit of an extra boost so that you have the edge chasing down opponents on similar movement speed levels or similar boot levels. The scaling HP gives you more HP after level 7, but the flat health is something that I like a lot, especially in solo queue, because you're often going to be all-inning before level 7 almost every game at some point. So I like that it gives me an early advantage if we end up fighting early, which happens a lot. So for the Hail of Blades page, Obviously, Hail of Blades enables Braum to get his passive off in a lot more situations. Guardian and Glacial both have issues on Braum. Guardian can be activated by using an ability on an ally like Braum's W, taking a lot of damage in a short duration while standing right next to an ally, or if you or an ally take lethal damage while you're standing right next to them. The problem is that you don't always want Guardian to go off every time you W to someone on Braum. But if they take damage from anything after you W to them, it will go on cooldown, including jungle camps and neutral objectives. Braum also usually Ws to minions in lane, not to an ally, forcing you to try to get Guardian off using the other two methods, which are much more difficult and inconsistent. This means that Guardian is always going to be better on enchanters who want it to go off every time they shield their ally. It will always be less efficient on Braum because of this design. However, Guardian could still be the best rune choice despite this inefficiency. Braum doesn't hard CC frequently enough to run Glacial Augment, especially after the slow got nerfed from 30% to 20%, and the stats show Glacial consistently underperforming Guardian. As for Hail of Blades, you go Hail of Blades. Sudden Impact is the best in slot and actually outperforms Cheap Shot since you can proc Sudden Impact with your W, and Sudden Impact was reworked so that instead of giving you like Lethality or Magic Pen, Sudden Impact is just giving you true damage on your next attack, and it gives you more true damage than Cheap Shot, but you have to be able to use a dash, which Braum has, so it's just better. It adds a good amount of damage to an already aggressive rune page and helps you with those all-ins with it. Deep Ward seems to give the most utility in slot and has been performing really well as a rune in this slot since they've changed them to these new warding runes. It makes it impossible to clear 2 wards with 1 sweeper, and allows your trinkets to last longer in lane. Treasure Hunter enables me to accelerate my build in a way that Braum can't do with most other rune pages, although of course you can consider other runes like Relentless Hunter in this slot to be able to roam more early. Biscuits give you extra HP, which is very strong on Braum, as we've talked about, especially with the less tanky page, and helps you win all-ins and survive poke in lane. And Approach Velocity has very good synergy with Braum Q, and Hail of Blades by allowing you to chase down your opponent, which is extra important when you have a lot of extra auto attacks and attack speed. Other options are to run some of the things you would have run with Guardian secondary, like Font of Life, Bone Plating or Second Wind, or even Overgrowth, if you feel like you need extra survivability instead of chase down with Approach Velocity. There's an item set that I'll be posting in the description that you can just copy into your client by going to Collections, Items, Import Item Sets. For starting items, we have obviously the support item and 2 health pots, as well as the yellow trinket. I just put Control Ward and Sweeper in here so I have easy access to them, but you're not really starting these most of the time. Core items, we're going to be trying to buy our Swiftness Boots, Refillable Potion, Solstice Slay, and Locket. Solstice Slay is just by far and away the best support item on Braum. Refillable Potion provides 200 extra HP for only 150 gold if you have time to use it. In comparison to a Ruby Crystal, which is giving you 150 HP for 400 gold, it's just a great item to help you survive poke in lane, but also in general for laning in solo queue because of its value. And then you can even sell it back for 60 gold when you need to complete an important item or you run out of item slots. For boots, I usually buy Swiftness Boots, which give you the most movement speed early for being able to roam and dodge skill shots and fight better in lane. It has the highest win rate on Braum and helps with slows, which are difficult to deal with in many of Braum's worst matchups like Karma and Senna. It can be okay as well to not upgrade for boots for a long time on Braum, especially if his other items are strong. This is because Braum doesn't chase his opponents down most of the time outside of lane. He's a disengaged champion that does best when the enemy team is running into him, and you can save like 1,000 gold by not buying boots, which can accelerate your build, allowing you to get access to important items early. But currently his items are not strong enough in my opinion to justify skipping boots, and it's also harder to get away with this the higher elo you go and the more skill shots the enemy team has. One of the other reasons why we go Swiftness Boots right now on Braum almost all the time is because your generic boot options that you would go, like Plated Steel Caps and Mercury Treads, are really, really heavily nerfed and just aren't that good anymore. For your core build, right now Braum almost always gets boots first, followed by Locket, and then one of the most diverse roster of items that he's had to choose from in a while. There's an argument to be made for going Heartsteel first, and then Unending Despair, even after the nerfs, but it's rarely done and there isn't much data to support it. But on paper, it does seem to be decent. We'll talk about that later. Items really have two parts that are important on Braum. How much do they increase his effective HP, or tankiness, and how much do you gain from their active and passive? For example, we have a breakdown between Locket and Heartsteel. So I won't do all of the math, but I'll give you the basic takeaway. Heartsteel makes you 12.5% tankier than Locket as a first item. The main reason for this is because tank supports, or most champions in the game in general, but Braum as well, are really missing about 600 HP for the amount of armor and magic resist that they start the game with, in order for that armor and magic resist to be efficient in terms of effective HP. So there's a balance between building health and building armor and building magic resist, and Braum's down about 600 HP. Obviously, Locket and a lot of other support items are only giving you 200, so going an item like Heartsteel, and this is one of the reasons why Warmogs was so good, was not because of its passive when it was viable on support, but was because of just the raw amount of HP that it was giving you was making you much tankier than an item like Locket. So even nowadays, you have Heartsteel as a item that gives you a ton of HP like Warmogs did, and is actually much cheaper. So Heartsteel makes you 12.5% tankier than Locket as a first item. However, you also delay the use of actives and passives that you would gain access to on all of your following items by 800 gold because it's more expensive. This is a fair trade-off that can be evaluated situationally. Since you're 12.5% tankier, it's worth 370 extra effective HP, which is more than your team will get in an average fight from Locket. So actually, you become so much more tanky from Heartsteel compared to Locket that you actually make up for the amazing active that you have in an item like Locket by building Heartsteel instead. It is also worth noting that this 370 effective extra HP is also considering a cost adjustment. So the way that this math was done was assuming that you built Locket and then you built a bunch of HP after Locket for the extra gold that you have. So it actually makes you a lot tankier than this. It's something like 800 extra effective HP. But if you cost adjust between the two, it's only 370, which still is about as much value as you would get from like a Locket active. And then, of course, you also have the other things that Heartsteel gives you, like extra max HP when you sometimes get its passive off, or the extra size, which has some unique synergy with Braum E by making him bigger and able to block more with it, and bonus damage on hit, which a champion like Braum is trying to auto-attack kind of as much as he can, so it's not terrible. And then if you are going to go Heartsteel first, you would go Unending Despair second, even after the nerfs, because if you hit 2 targets 3 times with its proc, you would get 521 damage and healing and value, even after enemy resists and stuff like that, and after the nerfs. So it's still quite good when you're getting 521 in value compared to items like Locket that are giving you maybe 300 Locket Redemption Knight's vow as a baseline for support items, giving you around 300 to 360 value worth of healing, shielding, damage reduction, that sort of thing per fight is what we're looking at. So you definitely can build Heartsteel and Unending Despair as your first 2 items on Braum, but that's not a very common build, and it's a really high risk thing to build that way because you're now hoping that your build is better than the regular build that everyone's running. And for me personally, especially at a high level of play, I would rather build the build that everyone else is running and let my Braum gameplay and the way the decisions that I'm making in game aside from my items dictate my win rate and how I'm doing, rather than hoping that this build, which has some potential to be decent, rather than hoping that that build is better without a lot of data behind it. I'd rather just build what everyone's building so that my gameplay on Braum and my decision making and all those other things we've talked about shine and come through and reflect my win rate. So now we're going to talk about the regular build. So we would go Locket first pretty much every game. It's a really good item because it's giving you HP and it's giving you armor and magic resist, and there's not a lot of items that are giving you both armor and magic resist. So as far as effective HP goes, if you're not going to build something like Heartsteel, it's better than pretty much any other tank or support item that you could go as a tank support. And obviously it's, active is, up there as a baseline with any item that we would potentially go. So Locket is pretty much built every time first item on Braum. So then we have to look at all these other situational items that we have and ask ourselves when we would build them and in what order do we think about them in game so we can streamline the decision-making process. So we have Iron Elixir. We're going to start with ones that aren't really part of our regular item decision-making process that we would see in some really weird situations and that we're not thinking about in terms of the way that we're going to complete our build. So Iron Elixir is really, really strong. It gives you a ton of value for the gold that it costs, but obviously then that gold just goes away once the potion wears off. So the thing that people, I think, mistake about Iron Elixir that I want to point out is that people think that you should build elixirs only when you're full build. But the reality is that winning or losing, if you think the game is going to end in the next 3 minutes and you don't have an item that you're going to complete anytime soon, building an elixir and being able to have a better chance of closing out the game, or if you're about to lose no matter what and you're not close to completing an item and having a better chance of holding, is way better to buy Iron Elixir than to buy any component item for, any other item. So you should be buying Iron Elixir if you really do think that the game is going to end in the next 3 minutes. Ionian Boots are another boot that's performing pretty well on Braum in terms of win rate, but not picked as much. So I've thrown it in here as an alternative to Swiftness Boots. It's not something that I have built in a really long time on Braum. I don't really think that you need more ability haste than you're going to get from your items. And I also think that, again, he's not a super summoner spell dependent champion, so I don't know that you need that to keep your summoner spells up. So I'd rather have Swiftness Boots for the movement speed, but it's definitely a viable option. But it's, something where you're either going to be someone who likes going Swiftness Boots or feels that that's better or best, or you're going to be someone who likes Ionian Boots and feel that they're best. And so it's not really a situational item that you're thinking about every game. It's just, am I running this or am I running this? So that's in there. QSS is also in here. For 1300 gold, being able to cleanse a CC is very good value, even on a support champion. And you'll see in pro play sometimes that supports will build this or have built this in the past. And it also gives magic resist, and you don't have a lot of good magic resist options on Braum. So as a cheap gimmick item to give you a little bit of power in a game where there's a lot of CC, it's not the worst to build it, but it's not something I ever try to build. It's just something that I don't build, but it is worth mentioning that you could go an item like this for sure. So being able to ignore, our Ionian Boots, our Elixir, and our QSS, we also have Bramble Vest and Thornmail. Now, most of the value we've been talking about from items comes from the effective HP or the and even outside of supports, like either the damage the item gives you plus what its active and passive are doing, or on, a tank, what is the effective HP that we're gaining plus what the active and passive is doing. So because the active and passive is such a huge part of items, being able to get access to the full passive, essentially of Thornmail for 800 gold instead of 2,450 by just building Bramble Vest makes Bramble Vest a much better option than completing Thornmail. So you do get a little bit of extra damage when people hit you if you've completed Thornmail, but the anti-heal is the same, and the anti-heal is the main reason where we're buying the item and getting value from the item. So the only reason why Thornmail is in the item set is if you've already built Bramble Vest and decided to build it, then you're going to upgrade Thornmail as your last item, right? You're going to upgrade Bramble to Thornmail as your last item. But this isn't really an item on its own that we're considering. We're considering looking at Bramble. Then, of course, we've already talked about and covered Heartsteel and Unending Despair, which can be built together as an item 1 and 2, but is just a completely different build path than starting your normal Locket support build. So what that really leaves us with is Bramble Vest, Knight's Vow, Redemption, Mikhail's, Trailblazer, Frozen Heart, Abyssal Mask, Randuin's, and Rookern. And so let's think about what items here are situational and have certain conditions that need to be met in order for them to be built, and what items are generic. So the generic items here are going to be Redemption, Trailblazer, and Rookern. Those are the only three that don't rely on specific conditions about the enemy team or our team or anything like that, or whether we're winning or losing the game in order to be built. So if they would only be good if none of our other items are good in slot. If the value that we get from the actives and passives on the other items just isn't all that good. But most of the time, we're going to find that we're going to have many other item options with all those other items, that we're going to be building things other than these first. And then we have to say, okay, well, if nothing's good and we are building one of these three, which one are we going to opt to go? Well, we're almost always going to opt to go Redemption, because when we look at what we get from like Rookern or Trailblazer, the thing that's really nice about Redemption is that Redemption is going to synergize really well with Locket and Knight's Vow, because it's going to increase both of them. And Redemption is going to give like one of the most powerful actives that you can get from a support item. Where Redemption falls a little bit short is in terms of its effective HP, it's very low, but it's also very cheap compared to the other two. And Trailblazer is an item that you really want to build early on support as a first item to roam a lot. And so it just doesn't make sense to be looking at building Trailblazer as a second, third, fourth item on a champion like Braum. Rookern you can get away with sometimes because it has so much better effective HP than Redemption, but I wouldn't go it unless you felt like you couldn't build Knight's Vow because you were too far behind to build Knight's Vow. So that's kind of how we're looking at those, generic catch-all items that we would rely on building if our other items aren't good. But here's how we're going to go through the situational items and determine what we're actually building after Locket. If it's a good game where they have a lot of healing, if it's a good game for anti-heal, then we just go Bramble Vest. Bramble Vest is the highest value here if it's good, because it only cost 800 gold to get to the passive or active. And in terms of how it does for effective HP, it's not great because, again, we'd prefer HP, then we'd prefer magic resist, then we'd prefer armor, and it's just a lot of overloading on armor. But it does fine on effective HP by giving us a bunch of armor. So, especially early on. So we would just go Bramble Vest if they have multiple strong healing champions. Think of things like Vladimir, Warwick, things like that in other lanes. And then the other situation where we'd obviously want to go anti-heal is if they have a Soraka or a Sona or a, very heavy healing enchanter. And oftentimes, right, while it is better for a mage or an AD carry to get their anti-heal items because they can apply it to more people, their condition for applying it is easier by just doing damage, whereas we have to get hit by somebody. The fact that Braum can build it so early means that you'll get a lot of value from it, because you can't oftentimes in games against healers like that wait until your AD carry is at fourth item to build anti-heal. You need to get it early. And most players playing AD carry or mid, even though they could just go executioners and sit on executioners and then finish their item later, or just go Oblivion Orb and then finish their item later, in solo queue they just unfortunately don't do that very often and don't know to do it. So even if it's less efficient to pick up a Bramble Vest for anti-heal than what your team could pick up, if they're not picking it up, it's better that somebody gets it early than nobody. So keep that in mind about Bramble Vest. So Bramble Vest is good if they have multiple healing champions or a really strong enchanter. Knight's Vow works in a really interesting way, and I think it's one of the most misunderstood items on Braum. Knight's Vow is better if you're winning and ahead, and worse if you're behind and losing. And the reason for this is the damage that you redirect from, let's say you put it on your AD carry, is dealt to you as true damage. But your AD carry would have had some resistances. So if your AD carry was going to take 100 damage, they have 30, 40, 50% damage reduction, depending on what stage of the game you're at. So they would have only taken, 50, 60, 70 damage, but you're taking that 100 damage as 100 true damage. The nice thing about the item is that if your AD carry does the same amount of damage that they're taking, then you will heal for the same amount, and so you won't take any damage, and you'll just have the net positive of redirecting that damage from them to you with no cost to you. But if you're in a losing game where your team is just getting blown up, building this item is actually going to amplify the amount of damage that you're taking, that your team is taking, by doing more damage to you than it would have to your AD carry. And yes, it's a little bit nice that you're redirecting it from them to you, but you could probably find, especially in a meta like this with many viable items, you could probably find an item that gives you that 300, 360 value per fight, but doesn't do a bunch of damage to you and hurt you as a negative consequence. So if you're losing the game, I really advise against building Knight's Vow, even though Locket and Knight's Vow are the only items, tank support items that synergize really well with Braum. So Knight's Vow can kind of be a bait, and you really shouldn't be building it unless you're winning or ahead. But it is a really good item if you're winning, which also means that, of course, when you're playing games, if you can play a controlled game, make sure that you're winning, make sure that you're always able to go Knight's Vow second, you're much more likely to win if you're putting yourself in winning or even scenarios where you feel like you can go Knight's Vow second. As far as effective HP and stuff like that goes, unfortunately, it's another armor item, so it's giving us a little bit of health, a little bit of armor, when we're already over-indexed on armor, so that kind of sucks as opposed to being able to go a magic resist item, but we just don't have a lot of those as options. So then we have Mikhail's. Mikhail's, obviously, you need somebody to that has a lot of CC on the enemy team, or the whole enemy team needs to have a lot of CC to get enough value out of both the heal and the cleanse. I think you need to basically get 120 damage worth of value out of cleansing somebody. So if you're able to cleanse somebody every fight with Mikhail's, even on Braum, this can be a fine option. It gives you 200 HP, just no armor and no magic resist, so it's the exact same build path and cost as Redemption. So there's no reason why you can't go Mikhail's on Braum, even though it is more of an enchanter item. There's no reason why you can't go it, but again, like Redemption, you probably wouldn't go it unless you're building other healing and shielding items like Locket, Knight's Vow, Redemption with it, and you need to go it in those certain situations. So it's an item that I rarely ever build. Frozen Heart is going to give you that 300 to 360 damage reduction in a team fight if they have 2 or more heavily attack speed reliant champions, like a Jax, or an AD carry that may be using it. But keep in mind, you have to be in range of them in order for it to apply. And the other thing about it is that not only do you have to be in range for it to apply, and on Braum, you're often playing protecting your backline, not really on top of the enemy team and applying it to everybody. But again, in terms of effective HP, it's an item that gives us no health and no magic resist, only armor, so it's even worse for overloading us towards that armor side of the build, especially if we're thinking about it as like a third item in combination with like a Knight's Vow or another armor item. We can get really one-sided on the armor on a champion like Braum. Then we have Abyssal Mask, which is sort of similar concept to Frozen Heart in terms of, are you on top of the enemy team to actually even be applying Abyssal Mask in the same way a Leona or another support champion would? But Abyssal Mask can be worth it if you have like multiple AP champions on your team, like 2+ AP champions on your team. The way that the math works out is that you need to deal 3,000 magic damage during a fight to people who are in range of your Abyssal Mask. And that's quite a lot. So you definitely need at least 2 or maybe even 3 AP champions on your team in order to get value out of this on Braum, especially because he's not going to, keep these people in range 100% of the time. If the fight's really spread out, it's really not going to be doing a whole lot. One thing that the item does have going for it is that it just gives you HP and magic resist. And so if the enemy team also has like 2 AP champions or more, and you really need that magic resist balancing out in your build effective HP wise, this is a really good item to go if you have 2 AP champions or more and they have 2 AP champions or more, because it can really balance out the amount of armor and magic resist you have in your build. Randuin's is an item that situationally should be good, when you see multiple crit champions on the enemy team. But because it only reduces the damage that you take from crits by 30%, the math works out in such a way that you really need if they have 2 crit champions on the enemy team, they need to be at full crit build. So they need to be at 4 crit items. And if they have 3 crit champions on the enemy team, then they need to be at like 2 or 3 crit items. So even with a lot of crit champions on the enemy team, there are situations where you could build this later on into your build, where you have more HP to make this item more effective, and where you have where they're further along into their build, and so they're more often critting you than not. But you really need like 50% of the enemy team's damage to be crits. And when you need 50% of their damage to be crits, you need half of the people who are doing damage on their team to be critting 100% of the time to do that to you, not just, 50% of the time. Because if half their damage is critting half of the time, you're only getting 25% of their team's damage in crits. So you're just not reducing a whole lot with Randuin's. It is worth noting, of course, though, that Randuin's is nice because it gives you a lot of extra HP, starting to get a little bit more expensive, though. And of course, it does have the active effect as well of slowing around you, which can be nice and is a little bit hard to factor in. So you could be a little bit more forgiving with when you choose to build the item. And that basically concludes it. And then, right, you would go, if you're really under-indexed on magic resist, especially if you haven't built Knight's Vow in the items that you've selected, maybe you end up with like Locket and Frozen Heart, or Locket and Bramble Vest. You're probably going to go as a generic item, Rookern, because it's giving you so much HP and effective HP and magic resist. If you're going Locket and Knight's Vow, you're probably going to pair that with a generic Redemption as a third item if you have no other good situational item to build. So that's essentially how you would build the items. As far as the math on why these items are viable or aren't viable, I'll probably cover that in just a generic support item video, but you should just trust me on this, and I've done a lot of math on it, and the win rate data and the amount that people build these things also usually suggests this. For items that you might be tempted to build on Braum that I would recommend against building, plated steel caps and merc treads, obviously extremely heavily nerfed, performing pretty bad in win rate compared to boots like Swiftness boots and Ionian boots, although they are built more frequently. Plated steel caps and merc treads are still built more frequently, so that can cause the win rate to tend to go a little bit lower statistically. So that, that's part of it, but I really don't think that they're good to build anymore. Zeke's is a bit of a bait item because it's one of the few tank support items in the game. You only have 4 tank support items in the game. You have Locket, you have Knight's Vow, you have Trailblazer, and you have Zeke's. So a lot of people think, you just build the 4 tank support items that are in the game. But of course, Trailblazer doesn't do that well on Braum. Most people don't build it. You're better off with regular tank items like we talked about. Similar thing with Zeke's. One of the problems that Zeke suffers from is when you get 300 shielding or healing from an item like Locket or Redemption, the effective HP you're giving your team is actually a lot more than that, because you're giving 300, but if your team has like 50% resistances, you're actually giving 600 effective HP. Whereas damage items work the opposite way. So if you deal 50 damage or something like that, you're often only dealing like 25 because you're going into the enemy resist. So if you have 2 items and one says you heal for 100 and one says you deal 100 damage, the damage item is actually only doing 50 in game because of resistances, and the heal for 100 is actually providing 200 effective HP to your ally because they have resistances to use with that HP. So that can wildly swing how powerful items sound numbers-wise when you take that into account. And so one of the problems that Zeke suffers from is the vast amount of time and amount of people that you would have to have in the Zeke's active damage pool to do enough damage to be anywhere near the value that you're getting from like a Locket or Redemption or even Abyssal Mask or Frozen Heart in the right situations, right? Any of these other items. Of course, it provides the slow field as well, and that does provide some value, but even with that, it's really not even close and not that great on a champion like Braum. And oftentimes when you're ulting on Braum, you're already putting down a slow field. So like we talked about, you have 2 slow fields on top of each other, and it's just going to take the greater slow. So because of that, you're kind of wasting the slow guaranteed off of your ult or off of the item. Watchful Wordstone used to be quite a strong item to round out your build because it was increasing your maximum HP by like 10%, but now it just gives you a flat amount of HP, armor, and magic resist, and then increases your word slots. Really, the extra 1 word slot and extra 1 control word slot are not worth a whole item slot for you when you could build such powerful tank items. And so it's really just not that great of an item anymore. Fimbulwinter got nerfed really heavily because actually Jace was abusing it, and so it's even worse now than it was before. But of course, Braum's not going to want to stack tier. He only has one ability that he can really use to stack it well, and so Fimbulwinter just ends up coming online way too late for Braum. They've nerfed the amount of shielding that you get from it when you do complete it, and the amount of HP and stuff like that. So Fimbulwinter is just not a great item on Braum because of that. We have Sunfire Cape. Sunfire Cape suffers from the same problem as Zeke's to a certain extent. That damage isn't that high compared to the utility and the tankiness you could get from, frankly, almost any other tank item. And so it fails to deal enough damage basically to be worth it. And it is starting to get a little bit expensive, for a support. Spirit Visage, I don't know how to say that, is good if you have a bunch of built-in healing and shielding in your kit, but Braum doesn't have a ton of healing and shielding that he's able to increase with this item, so it's just not a good tank item on him. Wit's End, I just said your AD carry will be at their Wit's End if you build this item. Obviously, you shouldn't be building like attack speed items on Braum support. If you want to do that, go play the Braum top. Force of Nature could be another magic resist option, but we're getting really expensive here again, although Rookern's expensive as well, but Rookern's quite a strong item. It's very, very situational because you have to have champions that are dealing magic damage to you that are casting multiple abilities over and over again. Think battle mages like Cassiopeia and Rise and stuff like that. They're able to cast multiple times because you need to get hit with multiple magic damage abilities in order for it to really start working and stacking up. So I just think that compared to other magic, resist items that we do have, like Rookern, which is going to just make you a lot tankier and work in 90% of situations or 95% of situations instead of Force of Nature, especially for support. And then you have, Abyssal Mask, which is going to provide value to your team and be a much cheaper, more cost-effective support item rather than magic resist item like Force of Nature. So for those reasons, it just kind of falls through. Not a lot of people build it anyways, and there's not a lot of win rate data or anything like that to support it. Hollow Radiance is a magic resist item that is basically the magic resist equivalent of Sunfire Cape. Again, it just doesn't do that much damage, and you're not in the middle of their entire team on a champion like Braum most of the time, hopefully, if you're positioning correctly in team fights. So it just doesn't end up giving you that much value. Deadman's Plate is just kind of like a more expensive version of Trailblazer for supports that doesn't come with the slow, and it just doesn't really make sense if you're going to build Deadman's Plate on Braum or any other support. I feel like you should probably just be building Trailblazer first, and then maybe you get Deadman's Plate if you want both, but you definitely should not be looking to build Deadman's Plate. And then Warmogs is obviously heavily nerfed, also very, very expensive now. You don't get access to the passive until you build it, unless you were building it much later into your build. So Warmogs just doesn't really make sense, on support or on a champion like Braum anymore. So that's the gist of it. Hope that you guys found this guide helpful and that you got better at Braum, got better at the game, and understand a little bit about how much goes into understanding and playing a champion at a high level in the game. With that being said, good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.